Okay, you've brought us some really interesting source material today. It's an analysis from Dr. Pooyan Ghamari, a Swiss economist, looking at the whole Iran nuclear deal situation.
Yeah, and specifically, his take on why the usual strategies, relying so heavily on sanctions, just haven't really delivered the results people hoped for.
Exactly. So, our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack Dr. Ghamari's thinking. We want to understand why he feels this pressure strategy might be, well, running out of steam.
And also dig into what the key players involved actually want. What are their real motivations, maybe beyond the usual public statements.
Right, and then explore these alternative paths he suggests for maybe finding a more sustainable way forward. And just to be clear, we're sticking strictly to the analysis provided in this source material you've shared.
And it's interesting because the source points to some things you might not expect, like the idea that sanctions could have actually, maybe ironically, strengthened certain parts of the regime.
Or that Iran's biggest weak spot might actually be internal, something surprising like its infrastructure.
Exactly. It sort of challenges the standard narrative.
Definitely. So let's jump in and explore this different angle on a really long-standing global issue.
Let's do it.
Okay, so Dr. Gamari kicks things off by arguing that this decades-long reliance on sanctions, well, it just hasn't worked out as planned.
Yeah, he talks about diminishing returns. His analysis suggests the sanctions haven't forced the big changes they were supposed to. If anything, they seem to have hardened the ideological lines in Tehran.
And maybe the most crucial point, the source says that despite all this pressure, Iran's nuclear program kept advancing.
That's a really key finding he highlights. Sanctions definitely caused economic pain, no doubt. But Ghamari argues they didn't actually stop the nuclear progress itself.
So instead of collapsing,
Iran developed this strategy he called a defiant resistance economy.
which sounds important. He also makes a point to remind us the JCPOA back in 2015, that was purely a nuclear deal, right?
Right, just focused on non-proliferation. It wasn't meant to be a silver bullet for all of Iran's actions or behaviors.
And according to the source, when the U.S. pulled out in 2018 and brought back maximum pressure, the whole deal just unraveled pretty fast.
Yeah, very visibly. By 2025, which is the time frame the source looks at, Iran's enrichment, its stockpiles, they were way beyond the old limits. Inspections got restricted, diplomacy basically stalled, gridlock.
And here's where Dr. Gamari offers, I think, a really interesting insight. He says the gamble Washington took, that extreme pressure would cause, a popular uprising or make the elite just give up, that gamble didn't pay off.
His analysis actually suggests the opposite happened. It empowered the hardliners, these economic networks tied to the IRGC, like Qatam al-Anbiya.
That's the Guard's big construction and engineering arm.
Exactly. And that made it really politically toxic, even for the more pragmatic people in Tehran, to really engage seriously on the diplomatic front.
So the isolation didn't just cut Iran off from the West, it kind of pushed them elsewhere and strengthened certain groups inside.
That's the argument. The source highlights how this period sped up Iran's pivot towards the East China, Russia, and really cemented those networks built specifically to get around sanctions.
Okay, so if sanctions haven't really worked as intended, maybe even had some negative side effects, then a better strategy has to start with understanding what everyone actually wants.
Right, definitely.
So who does Dr. Gamari identify? What are their core interests, according to this analysis? Let's start with Iran.
Okay, Iran. The leadership seems to view nuclear capability as, well, two things: leverage for deals and a shield against attack. Ghamari suggests their goal is to stay near the weaponization threshold, but not cross it.
Using that closeness to bargain for sanctions relief.
Pretty much. And internally, even with massive problems, the source mentions ecological crises, stagflation, the regime's #1 priority, seems to be elite survival, not necessarily broad economic equity for everyone.
So for Iran, a win looks like lasting sanctions relief without having to fundamentally change the system, plus maintaining regional clout and maybe being less dependent on China.
That sums up Ghamari's framing of their goals, yeah.
Okay, what about the other side? The U.S. and the E3, the European allies.
Their main goal is pretty clear: stop Iran getting nuclear weapons. Plus, ensuring Israel's security and regional stability. But Ghamari's analysis says their tools might need an update.
Meaning sanctions aren't enough.
He argues that sanctions, especially if there's no clear, believable diplomatic path offered alongside them, they just aren't the deterrent they used to be.
Partly because, as you said, Iran's gotten pretty good at dodging them, even increasing oil exports despite the rules.
Exactly. The pressure isn't choking off their economy enough to force a major policy shift on the nuclear front or regionally.
And you've got Russia and China. How do they play into this?
Well, they tend to see Iran as a useful partner against what they view as U.S. dominance. And economically, Iran's valuable too.
Their bigger goal is more like a multipolar world.
Right. They don't necessarily want a nuclear blow up,
Yeah.
but Iran being isolated from the West kind of serves their interests in challenging the current global order.
China wants the cheap oil, ways around Western finance.
And Russia sees Iran as a fellow sanctions target, a useful military partner sometimes. Ghamari points out something interesting here.
What's that?
A nuclear deal that actually worked, one that brought Iran back into the Western economic fold, that would actually weaken this Iran-Russia-China alignment. So the status quo works better for them in some ways.
Okay, last group. Israel and the GCC states, the Gulf countries.
For them, it's primarily security. They fear a nuclear Iran, obviously, but also an Iran that feels emboldened by getting its economy back online.
But Ghamari points out a kind of paradox here too, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating. While they have these major security fears, these steam countries could actually benefit from things like lower oil prices globally or maybe long-term regional infrastructure projects if Iran became, a stable participant.
But that's a huge if.
A huge if. He stresses it's totally conditional on Iran seriously pulling back on proxy support and accepting really strict oversight. So, yeah, very complex, sometimes contradictory interests all around.
Okay, let's circle back to the sanctions and this resistance economy. The source has some specific numbers on this, doesn't it?
It does. Ghamari notes the Iranian economy really took a hit between 2010 and 2020 under sanctions. Big contraction.
But then,
between 2020 and 2024, it bounced back significantly, like 17% growth.
and not because the pressure eased up, but because they adapted.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The source talks about how they did it, smuggling networks, using crypto, complex barter deals with China, this whole shadow fleet for shipping. That's the nuts and bolts of the resistance economy.
And Ghamari argues this isn't just making do, it's become like ingrained, a doctrine.
Yeah, taught in universities, part of the elite narrative.
Yeah.
And critically, it's massively boosted the economic power of the IRGC.
Which leads to that really crucial point Ghamari makes that sanctions might have, maybe unintentionally, helped the IRGC consolidate power.
How does he figure that?
Well, by cutting off legitimate international business and competition, sanctions basically created these distorted markets inside Iran. Lots of opportunities for what they call rent-seeking.
Profiting from control and access, not actual production.
Exactly. And the IRGC, with its position, was perfectly set up to grab those opportunities.
Okay, that makes sense. And this links to that idea he mentioned, the adversary entente.
Yes, he describes Iran working with Russia and China, not just politically, but forming this kind of informal economic bloc specifically to beat sanctions.
China's independent teapot refiners buying Iranian oil.
And Russia's shadow tanker fleet. Those are key parts of it, acting as a buffer for Iran's economy.
Which makes those unilateral sanctions feel symbolic sometimes.
That's his argument. And he adds another point. When the West sometimes eases up on enforcement, maybe because they're worried about oil prices spiking, that also chips away at the credibility of the whole sanction strategy.
Right. So his conclusion isn't necessarily tighten sanctions even more.
No, it's more like maybe offering Iran a genuinely better alternative path could be more realistic, more effective.
That seems to be the core argument coming out of this part of the analysis.
But, okay, beneath the surface, beyond the sanctions and the resistance economy, Dr. Ghamari points to a potential vulnerability, something internal.
Yeah, this is really interesting. He flags the country's collapsing water system as a major, major weak spot, an Achilles heel.
The source gives examples.
Stark ones, like Lake Urmia just vanishing, major cities facing massive water shortages, people having to move because of drought.
And the cause isn't just climate change, according to the source.
He points heavily at corruption and these huge, poorly planned mega projects, often led by the IRGC's own Khatam al-Anbiya, that have just wrecked water resources, turning fertile land into dust bowls.
Wow. And there's another related issue he mentions.
Yeah, the natural gas shortages. Iran has the second biggest reserves in the world, but people face blackouts, freezing in winter, because the domestic infrastructure is so inadequate.
So this internal crisis, water, domestic energy, how does that create an opportunity?
Ghamari sees this as a potential opening, maybe a rare one, for a different kind of engagement. He suggests offering conditional international help, investment, specifically targeted at these sectors: water management, domestic gas infrastructure.
And why target domestic needs specifically? What's the strategic thinking?
The logic is These sectors directly serve the ordinary Iranian population. They're less likely to directly enrich those IRGC networks focused on oil exports and illicit trade. It's a space where maybe diplomacy could meet real human needs and strategic goals at the same time.
Finding pressure points where help might actually bypass the usual gatekeepers.
That seems to be the idea.
Okay, so given this whole picture, the limits of sanctions, the players' motives, this internal vulnerability, Dr. Ghamari moves beyond critique. He proposes some concrete ways forward, some strategic pathways.
Right, he doesn't just point out problems, he offers potential solutions. First up, something he calls snap-forward economic triggers.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means designing a step-by-step agreement. If Iran meets a specific nuclear compliance step, it immediately unlocks a specific, tangible economic benefit.
It's like being allowed to buy civilian airplane parts from the U.S. or getting access to specific medical tech.
Exactly. But crucially, there has to be a clear, quick way to freeze or even reverse those benefits if Iran stops complying. It's about immediate, conditional rewards.
Okay, what's next?
Pathway 2, targeted domestic infrastructure support. Basically, allow international investment, but only for improving Iran's domestic natural gas supply.
Key point. For use inside Iran, not for export.
Right. The aim is practical. Reduce those winter blackouts people suffer through, maybe create some jobs outside the IRGC-dominated sectors, and again, avoid directly funding the export machine.
Makes sense. Third pathway.
Water conditionality. This links international funding for those critical water projects directly to verifiable reforms in how Iran manages its water.
And he suggests using NGOs, international agencies, to monitor.
Yeah, to make sure the money bypasses the problematic IRGC projects and actually helps the municipal water systems in regions in real crisis. So aid is tied to specific, measurable changes.
Okay, fourth. This sounds important.
Addressing the fear factor for businesses.
Right.
He calls it an investor reassurance mechanism. Because let's face it, a huge problem for any future deal is businesses being terrified that sanctions will just snap back.
So how do you fix that?
He suggests creating some kind of safety net, maybe a sovereign guarantee fund or an international escrow account managed by neutral parties, something to give Western firms a bit more confidence, manage that political risk if they decide to invest under a new agreement.
That seems crucial for making any deal stick in reality. And the last pathway.
This one's about subtly trying to weaken that adversary entente, the Iran-Russia-China link. He suggests quietly offering Iran better economic terms, more reliable investment deals than what they're getting from, say, China's teapot refiners or Russia's shadow fleet. Basically highlighting the risks of relying too much on just one or two partners who might have their own agendas.
Using economic realism as a lever, showing them that engaging more broadly might actually be more beneficial and stable for them in the long run.
Exactly. The idea is that maybe straightforward economic interests could succeed where ideological pressure has failed, shifting economics from just a stick to also being a potential carrot.
Right, repositioning it.
Yeah.
And Dr. Ghamari takes this thinking even further, doesn't he? Beyond just the nuclear file, towards regional integration.
He does. He sketches out a vision where let's say, rehabilitated Iran could actually become a hub for regional trade.
Yeah.
Think new transport corridors, energy cooperation, joint development zones.
But again, that's heavily conditional.
Oh, completely. He's very clear. This requires fundamental changes in how the Iranian regime behaves regionally.
And it would need a parallel security dialogue that actually includes Israel and the Gulf states.
Absolutely. He emphasizes this isn't some naive dream. It's about smart sequencing. You don't assume trust. You try to build it, maybe, through shared economic projects, multi-party initiatives, where everyone has a stake in stability.
Trying to build economic bridges instead of just digging deeper political trenches.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so pulling it all together, Dr. Ghamari's core message in this analysis seems to be that the Iran situation, it's not simple. It's not black and white, solvable with just one tool like sanctions.
No, it's deeply complex. You've got layers of mistrust, huge economic imbalances, fragmented power inside Iran. His main point is that you won't get a lasting solution through just force or pressure.
It demands a shift in the toolkit, moving away from blunt sanctions aimed at total surrender.
Towards more surgical incentives tied to specific actions, moving from just isolating Iran to having conditional oversight, and thinking less about short-term tactical wins and more about long-term strategic change.
It suggests policymakers maybe need to think differently too, not just as defenders of the current shaky situation, but maybe as architects of new possibilities for engagement.
That seems to be the implication. finding ways to create pathways toward mutual benefit, however difficult.
And for you, the listener, grappling with these different viewpoints, these alternative strategies Ghamari proposes, it's important because it shows there might be ways out of what often feels like an endless stalemate.
Yeah, it demonstrates that even with these incredibly tough, long-running global problems, there are different ways to analyze them, different potential approaches worth considering.
And Dr. Ghamari leaves us with a final, quite powerful thought to chew on.
He suggests that for Iran, may be true, sustainable power in the long run doesn't come from enriching uranium.
But from choosing to enrich its own people.
A really potent idea.
Definitely something to mull over.